In 2022, without firing a single shot, the United States froze $300 billion of Russia's foreign currency reserves. No bombs dropped, no boots on the ground. That wasn't war, that was dollar warfare. This is not a story about banks or Wall Street. It's the story of how a single currency conquered the world. Not with soldiers, but with debt, oil, and sanctions.
The US debt right now is very large. It's over $3 trillion when one looks at it in relation to the size of the United States economy. It's already over 25% of GDP. And I think that what's really very disturbing about the size of the US debt right now is the situation from which we've come.
The US dollar didn't just buy power, it became power. Today, over 90% of global currency trades involve the dollar. Whether you're in Tokyo, Nairobi, or Buenos Aires, chances are if you're buying or selling internationally, you're touching the greenback. It has become the most popular currency in the market. The dollar is the bloodstream of global commerce. But how did that happen? How did one currency become so unavoidable, so unstoppable? Well, to answer that question, we need to take a deep dive back to the ashes of World War II. So picture this. It's 1944. The war is definitely still raging on pretty hard, so 44 nations gather in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their mission is to try and find a way to rebuild the global financial system that had definitely grinded to a total halt. Because, yes, the war. In the aftermath of World War II, countries understood that strong economic cooperation was essential for rebuilding and securing long-term stability. There was a shared determination to create an international financial and monetary framework that would encourage collective growth and prevent the return of the instability that had plagued the world economy between the wars. During that earlier period, nations abandoning the gold standard, the onset of the Great Depression, and the eruption of trade wars had all contributed to a prolonged and devastating global downturn.
How selfish and how ridiculous can we be when we think that this world that we can live within ourselves, when we have so many billions of people in Asia alone, and the European country is old and get tired, and South America is suffering starvation, and we're going to set aside 175 million acres of land for a playground that has all the minerals and oil and resources, timber and hydropower? That's the most asinine thing I've ever heard of.
To avoid repeating such mistakes, policymakers envisioned a system that would stabilize exchange rates, discourage competitive currency devaluations, and still allow governments the freedom to pursue domestic goals such as full employment and rising national income. A central element of this vision was the creation of institutions that could enforce cooperation while respecting each country's internal priorities. Historical memory also played a powerful role in shaping this initiative. Germany's economic collapse in the 1920s remained a stark warning. The Treaty of Versailles had placed heavy reparations on Germany after World War I, and combined with poor fiscal policy, the country descended into hyperinflation. At its worst, prices were increasing by 41% daily. By late 1923, the US dollar was worth nearly 4 trillion German marks, rendering the currency virtually useless and forcing citizens to resort to bartering for basic goods. This economic breakdown laid the groundwork for social unrest and political extremism, culminating in the rise of the Nazi regime and eventually another world war. British economist John Maynard Keynes had warned of such consequences in his 1919 book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, where he criticized the harsh terms of the Versailles Treaty and predicted its destabilizing effects. Against this backdrop, world leaders saw the necessity of building a more resilient and cooperative international system to avoid another descent into chaos. Still, despite broad consensus on the need for change, the two most influential countries at the negotiating table, the United States and the United Kingdom, remained undecided on whether a global system of this kind would truly serve their national interests. Everything was an utter mess, and they needed to fix it fast. And that's exactly what the Bretton Woods meetings were for. In these meetings, they rubbed minds together, hoping to find the solution they so needed. Eventually, they decided it'd be best to make the dollar the foundation of their new economic reforms. The reason was simple. The United States had the gold and the guns. At the time, America held nearly 75% of the world's official gold reserves. Its industrial base was untouched by war. It had leverage, surplus, and stability. So the deal was struck. The dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. Every other currency would be pegged to the dollar. If you wanted to trade, you'd need dollars, and because those dollars were backed by gold, the world had faith. For much of the 20th century, the US dollar was anchored to gold through the Bretton Woods system. But by the 1960s, the foundation began to crack. America decided to go on the warpath, financing the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Cold War, and a sweeping set of domestic programs known as the Great Society. As the Federal Reserve pumped out more dollars to cover growing deficits, the US gold reserves couldn't keep up. Foreign governments concerned about the dollar's stability started converting their dollar holdings back into gold. By 1971, the pressure became unbearable. On August 15th, President Richard Nixon unilaterally ended the dollar's convertibility into gold, a moment now known as the Nixon shock.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
With that, the gold standard was officially dead, and the dollar became a flat currency, backed by nothing but the strength and credibility of the United States. In theory, this should have caused the dollar to collapse. A flat currency with no hard backing and rising US inflation would typically lead to a loss of confidence. But something else happened instead. Something engineered behind closed doors that cemented the dollar's global dominance for decades to come. In 1974, amid the oil crisis and soaring energy prices, the United States brokered a quiet but transformational deal with Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil producer. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger led the negotiations. The message to the Saudis was strategic and clear. Price all your oil exports exclusively in US dollars, and in return the US would offer military protection, advanced weaponry, and a deep alliance with the House of Saud. Saudi Arabia agreed. Soon after, other OPEC nations followed. From that moment forward, oil, the lifeblood of the global economy, was traded almost exclusively in dollars. This created a new system known as the petrodollar. Under the petrodollar system, every country on Earth needed US dollars to purchase oil. That meant constant built-in demand for dollars, regardless of America's trade deficits, inflation, or fiscal policy. Countries began stockpiling dollars in foreign reserves, and many reinvested those dollars into US Treasury bonds, effectively funding America's debt in exchange for access to oil. This was a masterstroke. The US had moved from a gold-backed dollar to an oil-backed dollar without ever having to explicitly declare it. Even after severing the gold link, Washington preserved the dollar's supremacy by anchoring it to a commodity even more indispensable than gold: energy. To this day, over 85% of global oil transactions are still conducted in US dollars. Not because the dollar is the most stable or moral currency, but because the system was built that way by American design. It gave the US unmatched financial leverage, the ability to run persistent deficits, print currency at will, and impose sanctions with devastating effect, simply by controlling access to the world's reserve currency. And the petrodollar's influence didn't stop at oil. As dollar reserves piled up, countries began using dollars in other international trade, reinforcing the currency's centrality. Institutions like the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and World Bank also operated in dollars, further embedding the system into the global financial architecture. This wasn't just economics, it was geopolitics, and for the US, it was power wrapped in green paper. For decades, developing nations looking to build roads, power plants, schools, and agricultural systems have turned to the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Bank. These institutions were created in the aftermath of World War II to promote global financial stability and development, but in practice, they've become key instruments of US-aligned financial influence, and at the center of it all is the US dollar. Most of the funding provided by the IMF and the World Bank is denominated in dollars. Countries receive loans in greenbacks but must repay in the same currency. While that may seem neutral on the surface, it creates a dangerous dependency. When local currencies weaken, as they often do during crises, the cost of repaying dollar debt balloons. Today, over 70% of all global external debt held by low and middle-income countries is dollar-denominated. For many of these nations, this isn't just a financial obligation, it's a trap. Dollar debt becomes especially lethal during periods of global tightening, such as when the US Federal Reserve raises interest rates. Higher rates strengthen the dollar, but make debt repayments costlier in local terms. At the same time, capital flight increases as investors flee riskier emerging markets for safer US assets, depleting reserves and weakening currencies even further. Countries like Sri Lanka, Ghana, Zambia, and Pakistan have been forced to confront the consequences. When default becomes unavoidable, they often return to the IMF for new financing or restructuring support. But the rescue is rarely unconditional. In exchange for assistance, countries must implement what are known as structural adjustment programs, or SAPs, policy packages that include austerity measures, currency devaluation, privatization of state assets, and cuts to subsidies and public services. These adjustments can be socially and politically explosive. In Sri Lanka, fuel and food shortages sparked nationwide protests in 2022 after the country's economic collapse and subsequent IMF negotiations. In Ghana, subsidy cuts triggered public backlash as inflation surged and the cost of living spiraled. Pakistan, too, has faced repeated cycles of IMF bailouts, each time surrendering more control over monetary and fiscal policy in the process. The underlying pattern is strikingly consistent. Countries borrow in dollars to fund development. They become vulnerable to exchange rate shocks and global interest rate hikes. When crisis strikes, they are left with little leverage. The conditions for aid then force them to relinquish economic sovereignty, handing over budget decisions, trade policy, and even central banking directives to external institutions. Critics argue that the system known as dollar debt diplomacy creates a dependency that stifles long-term development. While infrastructure is built, the cost is steep. Domestic economies are restructured to fit a global model that prioritizes debt repayment over national priorities. Even within the institutions themselves, questions have emerged. Former World Bank chief economist Joseph Stiglitz has been vocal about how conditional lending often exacerbates poverty rather than alleviates it.
People in the financial sector who became wealthy by engaging in predatory lending, abusive credit card practices, monopolization, a whole variety, market manipulation, a whole variety of activities that didn't make our economy stronger, in fact made it weaker, but actually were just taking money away from other people.
Others argue that dollar-based lending locks countries out of flexible monetary solutions, forcing them to adopt policies that benefit creditors more than citizens. In short, dollar-denominated loans have become a modern form of soft power. They're not enforced by soldiers or sanctions, but by spreadsheets and debt calendars. Yet the result is often the same: diminished autonomy, eroded public services, and governments forced to prioritize creditors over citizens. Sovereignty in this system isn't lost in battle. It's surrendered one repayment at a time. But debt isn't the dollar's only weapon. Sanctions are its sharpest blade. The US has turned financial restrictions into a tool of foreign policy. Today, more than 40 countries are under some form of American economic sanction. The US doesn't need to invade a country to paralyze it. It just needs to block its access to dollars. This is where America's control over the financial plumbing of the world becomes critical. Most global trade is settled through US-based correspondent banks, and almost all major international transactions pass through the SWIFT network, a messaging system for banks. While the US doesn't directly control SWIFT, it exerts overwhelming influence. When the US wants a country cut off, like Iran, North Korea, or Russia, SWIFT usually complies. And when you're disconnected from SWIFT, your economy becomes a financial island. You can't import, you can't export, you can't move money. The threat alone forces banks in other countries to follow American rules, even if they don't agree. This is financial compliance under duress. The dollar doesn't just dominate markets, it dictates behavior. Former chair of the Federal Reserve of the United States, Alan Greenspan, was totally right when he said this.
Are U.S. Treasury bonds still safe to invest in?
Very much so. I think this is not an issue of credit rating. The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that. So there is zero probability of default.
Since 2020, over 80% of all US dollars in existence have been created. Massive stimulus programs, quantitative easing, pandemic relief, the printing press has never worked harder. But this doesn't just affect Americans. When the US inflates its currency, the world feels it. Because global commodities, food, fuel, metals, are priced in dollars. When the dollar weakens or floods the system, wheat becomes more expensive in Egypt, gasoline spikes in Kenya, rice costs more in the Philippines. That's the quiet tax of the empire. The feds print all while the rest of the world pays. But empires don't last forever. And today, for the first time in decades, countries are pushing back. For decades, the US dollar stood unchallenged as the world's reserve currency. Nations needed it to buy oil, settle trade, borrow money, and store reserves. But that era of absolute dominance is beginning to crack. The global financial system is undergoing a quiet but profound transformation, one not driven by ideology, but by necessity. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are at the forefront of this shift. They are actively building parallel financial systems designed to reduce reliance on the dollar. This includes alternative payment platforms, bilateral trade agreements in local currencies, and proposals for a BRICS reserve currency backed by a basket of member currencies and possibly commodities like gold. In 2023, a significant milestone occurred. China and Saudi Arabia completed their first oil trades denominated in yuan, marking a direct challenge to the petrodollar system. The move followed years of closer energy and diplomatic ties between the two nations, reinforced by China's growing demand and Saudi Arabia's diversification goals under its Vision 2030 plan. For Beijing, this isn't just about economics. It's about reducing exposure to a dollar system increasingly used as a tool of coercion. Russia and Iran, both heavily sanctioned by the West, have accelerated efforts to de-dollarize. After being cut off from the SWIFT messaging system, Russia turned to SPFS, its local financial messaging system, and expanded its use of China's CIPS platform. Bilateral trade between Moscow and Tehran is now conducted in rials, rubles, and gold. In parallel, both countries have increased gold production and purchases. Central banks around the world are also adjusting. In 2022, global gold purchases by central banks hit their highest level in 55 years, led by countries like Turkey, China, India, and Uzbekistan. The message is clear. Physical assets are being prioritized over dollar-denominated reserves. By mid-2023, the dollar's share of global reserves had declined to about 58%, down from over 70% at the turn of the century. Even allies are diversifying. France completed a liquefied natural gas or LNG purchase from China in yuan in March 2023, the first such deal for a G7 nation. Southeast Asian nations, particularly Indonesia and Malaysia, have signed agreements with China and others to settle trade in local currencies. These are not isolated acts, they are signals of a broader movement. No single event will dethrone the dollar. Its dominance is rooted in decades of international entrenchment, Wall Street, US Treasuries, IMF voting power, global credit markets. But global trade and finance no longer run through one currency alone. The infrastructure of empire is being rebuilt node by node outside the dollar's reach. And in geopolitics, optics matter as much as substance. Every oil contract settled in yuan, every bank that bypasses SWIFT, every BRICS summit that calls for a new reserve currency, these are not just technical adjustments. They are rejections of a system long seen as overly politicized, overly weaponized, and increasingly risky for non-Western nations. For 70 years, the dollar was not merely money. It was the spine of a financial empire, an empire built on oil, enforced through debt, and maintained through trust, or something even more sinister, fear. But trust is fraying, and in a world where perception becomes reality, the momentum is shifting. This shift is not just about inflation, interest rates, or recession forecasts. It's about control over how nations store value, settle disputes, and assert sovereignty. Once that control begins to erode, it rarely reverses. The dollar may not fall in a day, but make no mistake, every yuan-priced oil contract, every rupee-denominated loan, every gold-backed bond issued outside of New York or London, these are cracks in the green foundation. Now it makes you wonder, is this green giant going to be felled soon, or will it stand its ground for many more years to come?